Welcome back to the Fundamentals of Object workshop. This is part 2 of the single stack objects lesson, and in this lesson we'll begin creating a single stack object, and then we'll review the configuration options associated with the stack base object. So let's pick up right where we left off. We are in the Object Workshop screen, and we're going to select the plus sign in the upper right-hand corner. And from there, we'll select the single stack object tile. So let's begin to create our own object. After opening the single stack template, the first step in creating an object is to complete the naming panel. So let's talk about defining the object's properties. The naming panel is like the other naming panels that we've seen in previous lessons. Here you can name the object, you can describe it, and specify whether it's a table or a view. And then of course you can name the table or the view. So we are going to name this object NO/TRN patient assessment. We can give it a description as having one row per assessment, and this object is going to be a table. Finally, we will name the table. After defining the object, we can select our stack base by clicking the green Base Object button. And using the drop-down, we'll find the object that we're looking for. So I'm going to search for SMTRN patient assessment. And once we've selected the object, we'll be directed to the Properties panel for the stack base. After selecting the stack base object, you'll want to define the properties of the stack base. The Settings panel allows you to do two things. We can add a comment, and we can select a default field group. You can add a comment at any point during the development of the object. Once a comment is entered, it'll appear beneath the name of the object in the stack. For example, if I enter assessments of patients potentially eligible for the Eat Right program, you can see where the comment displays beneath the object's name. In this panel, you can also define the default field group for fields published from this object. We'll review field groups in more detail when we explore the Published Fields panel. The Restrictions and Transformations panel is one of the most powerful features in Ursa Studio. It offers the ability to create derived fields, which are fields defined by using the data from other fields. For example, you could create a derived field that defines a patient's chronic kidney disease, or CKD stage, based on the value of the patient's most recent GFR lab result. In this panel, you can also quickly define data restrictions that are the equivalent of applying a where clause in a SQL query. In a somewhat analogous example, you could also think of a restriction as the equivalent of applying one or more filters to data in a spreadsheet. Finally, there's an option for reshaping wide tables to long tables. In this case, you could take a table with claims data where there are 25 different columns for diagnosis codes, and transpose that table into one with a single column containing all of the diagnosis codes. Let's take a moment to create a derived field. This will serve as an introduction to how to use these patterns. One of the columns in the patient assessment is a GFR lab value. We can use this column to create a flag indicating whether the patient has likely entered end-stage renal disease. We'll use the case when pattern to create this derived field. SQL developers will probably be familiar with this type of pattern, and for those of you who do not have a SQL background, this allows you to apply if, then, else logic to the object. So first, we'll select the field we want to create the derived value from, which is patient GFR. Next, we'll specify that the value in this field should be less than the value we're about to specify. In the next field, we will specify that the value to be defined is a number. And we'll now specify that the value in the patient GFR field must be less than 15. So the condition the derived field will be created from is observations in the patient assessment object with GFR values less than 15. Now we can select the Then option. This indicates that we are about to specify what value this derived field should contain if the condition of patient GFR is less than 15 is met. In the next field, we'll select the number option, which specifies that our indicator will be a number. Enter the number 1, which indicates that when GFR is less than 15, the derived field should contain the number 1. The else field specifies what value the derived field should contain if the condition patient GFR is less than 15 is not met. Here again, we'll select the number option, which allows us to enter a numeric value. Enter the number 0. When the condition is met, we'll see the value 1, and when the condition is not met, we'll see the value 0. From here, let's skip down to the field name. Let's call this field GFR value indicates ESRD. It's worth noting that the field name is how this derived field will be displayed throughout the Ursa Studio application. It's different from the derived fields column name, which we'll review in just a moment. Moving on to the next field, we'll select the Published option, which makes the field visible throughout the application. If the field were marked as unpublished, it would be available to other derived fields and restrictions, but it would not be visible in the Published Fields panel in the object's properties. Tabbing to the Column Name field, this system has already generated the derived fields column name as it'll appear in the object's underlying table. As you can see, it's derived from the field name. Now, if you want to override this default name, you can simply enter the desired column name by typing it in. We will dive into the difference between analytic and non-analytic fields a little bit later in this lesson, but for now, let's select the analytic option. We will also get a chance to explore the difference between indexed and non-indexed fields later in the lesson, but this derived field will not be indexed, so we will select the non-indexed option. We can include this field group in the patient fields group for now, but we can always change this later if needed. Moving on to block header, this option enables you to enter a name for a header that'll appear above the summary of the derived field. The headers are used to separate derived fields and restrictions into groups that have a common purpose. For the sake of exposition, we can call the header ESRD. The comment field here works like the one we reviewed in the settings panel. The comment will appear in the summary of the derived field, and we can add a quick comment as a callout to other users of this object. Once you've completed the template, you'll select the Done button. You'll now see a summary of the derived field, and a couple of quick notes I'd like to make about the summary. First, the green circle containing the letters DF indicate the summary is for a derived field. When a restriction is created, the circle will contain an R. Second, to the right of pattern name, in this instance, case when, is an icon that when selected will clone or duplicate the pattern. When creating a number of similar patterns, this option can save a lot of time. You can see the indicator that specifies the field is a published field in the upper right corner of the summary, as well as the comment that we left and a summary of the derived field. Okay, so we just created our first derived field. There are so many patterns available for creating derived fields, but it's beyond the scope of this course to explore all of them in detail, so we'll save those for a later course. However, we will add another couple of restrictions and transformation patterns before this course is over. Now let's take a look at the Published Fields panel. This is where you select which columns from the stack base object you want to retain in the object you're creating. The first option in this panel is the Inherit Field Settings from Base Object checkbox. When selected, this option sets the selection of which fields are analytic or indexed, the field labels and column names, and the field group associations to match those of the stack base object. A trick for inheriting the field settings from the stack base object while still being able to edit those inherited settings is to select and then unselect the checkbox. The next option is prepend text to default field names, which we'll review in just a moment. Looking at the Lab ID checkbox, you can think of the process of selecting which fields from the stack base object to publish as akin to defining which columns will be included in a select statement. Selecting the checkboxes to the left of a field name will include those fields in the object being created. Selecting the Analytic checkbox makes the field available to be split on in Analytics portal. In the first course in this series, we reviewed this functionality, which allows users to split or disaggregate the results of a measure by field, which creates subgroups of the measured results. This functionality is typically used for categorical fields with relatively few values. It's worth noting that you can change or adjust any of the parameters you're defining for this object at any time. For example, if you create an object, use it in a measure, and then decide to add new fields to the object or make certain fields analytic, you can do that at any time. The next column, Indexed, allows you to specify whether the field should be indexed by the database, which typically results in faster querying. This option is less about the experience of analytics portal users and more about the performance of the generation of these objects in the data model. For example, I know that Lab ID is a field that's going to be a commonly referenced linking criterion for other downstream objects, and therefore I would set this to be indexed. The field name and column name options will have default values shown in light gray print. If you don't want to change the default values, you can leave them as they are, and those names will be used in the object you're creating. If you do need to change the field or column name, you can do so by overriding the defaults. For the most part, if the downstream objects in the data model were set up correctly, you will not need to manually change these names. This ends up saving a fair amount of time of the more tedious work of defining column names and aliases typical in data work. It also ensures a certain amount of standardization in the column names, which is, of course, very useful. Looking at the field group dropdown, you are already familiar with the field groups from previous lessons, so you know that to set or change a field group, you can use the dropdown. All right, now that we have seen how the published fields work, let's look at the prepend text to default field names feature. This feature does exactly what it advertises. Whatever value you enter into this field will be prepended to the default field name values in the list below. A common use case for this functionality is to describe the role of the base or linked object in the context of the object being created. For example, let's say you have an object describing a medication therapy episode where you have essentially a period of time when patients have been taking the drugs. You might want to bring in information from the first and the last medication fill during that therapy episode. That information may reside in a single object, which means you would need to link or join the same object to itself with one object identifying the first fill in that episode and the second object identifying the last fill. In this scenario, you could use this feature to prepend the word first to the first object and last to the second object. So that's it for this lesson. We have begun creating a new object, and we dove into the details of the configuration options associated with the stack base object. Thank you for reviewing this lesson. I'll see you in the next one.